Hey everybody, this is Modern Refugee. Out here stacking a little wood, got a fire going, just tidying up. And I was thinking about something that I'm going to share with you guys here. In the preparedness community on YouTube, there's always something going on. There's always something to be concerned about. There's always something on our radars. And there's always things to do, but sometimes it's good to disconnect from all that stuff. And that's what I'm actually doing here today with this video, and I'm going to take you guys along. I'm going to share a few hunting and fishing stories from things that I was told from my grandparents, and my family's got a real long tradition of hunting, fishing, trapping. And I actually got a little memorabilia here that I'm going to show you guys as well to let you know that I'm not just BSing you here with these stories. But Michigan has a real long hunting and fishing tradition. And if you guys ever get a chance, there's a book by a gentleman by the name of Andrew Blackbird that talks about the Ottawa and the Chippewa, especially around the mid to late 1800s. And they go into a lot about how things were in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, Michigan, a lot of history, how they fished, how they lived. And a lot of stuff that's kind of fascinating. Anybody that's living the homestead kind of off-grid lifestyle, that's how those people just lived, and it's interesting to see how they did it years ago. My grandparents were born in the first part of the 1900s, and they had a lot of stories that they were told when they were kids on how people hunted. Well, this was sort of a farming area, so a lot of people would go to the northern part of the Lower Peninsula to hunt. Especially, a lot of folks would go out of like Saginaw, and they would go north. And hunting back then, that was a really long sort of deal. That wasn't just, now people go hunting for a few hours and they drive back home. But the stories that I was told, people would go hunting for weeks because they would take teams of horses up into the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, even some of them even as far as Mackinac, and they would leave around the 1st of November, and they would always try to be back around Christmas. So that was several weeks where people would go up there, and when they would hunt like that, they would go out and they would hunt, and they would if they shot a deer, they would take the insides out of that deer, and they would hang the deer right in the closest tree where they shot it as high as they could. They would always go in twos, from what I was told, and they would hoist those deer up into the trees, and they would just let them freeze right there where they were at, and then they would come back and they would collect those frozen carcasses, and then they would stack them back up on their horse teams, and they would bring that stuff back down here. And there was a lot of I guess fanfare that went along with that, because people were still hunting back then a little bit for food. It wasn't all agriculture. You around 1900, a guy could shoot 5 deer on a hunting license, and they would bring them deer back, and that would be that would be a portion of their food for the winter in this area. And I'll show you here one of my oldest pieces of memorabilia I got here. This is actually cover up the name here, but this is actually the oldest hunting license that I have, and belonged to my grandfather's brother. I don't know if you can see it over there in the corner, but this was issued in November of 1917, and it cost $1, and this was your hunting and trapping license for the season. And they by that point in time, they had reduced the amount of deer that you could get quite a bit. But back at the turn of the century, you could shoot 5 deer on a license per person. And then there was a period of time where we're at here in southern Michigan where there was no deer. The deer pretty much got all shot off, and it took a long time for them to recover. And I still remember when my mom telling a story when she was a kid back at the end of the 1940s, the beginning of the 1950s. 50s, she's seen the first deer. She's seen her first deer, and they were walking back behind their farm, and it was a doe that ran across the lane at the backside of their farm, and it was a really big thing for them to see a deer. And the big thing where we're at here in southern Michigan, it was pheasant hunting, and pheasants were a prolific game animal around here up until about the 1970s. I've had people tell me that are just a little bit older than me that in the 1970s they drive around like Saginaw, like the fields by Saginaw, and there would just literally be hundreds of pheasants out in those fields. But that's just not like that anymore as more and more agriculture came into play. Things like fence rows, ditch rows, small woodlots, that stuff all got cut down and kind of destroyed the habitat, so the pheasants kind of went by the wayside. You can still see an occasional pheasant around here, but it's not near what it was in the heyday back 50 years ago. Being so close to the Great Lakes, there was a lot of waterfowl hunting that took place around here. There was a lot of what they called market hunting around in the teens and in the 20s especially. They would shoot a lot of ducks, so they could take those to like the cities and sell them so the rich people could have ducks. But a lot of people did that for money, but it really affected the duck population. But duck hunting was huge around here just because of the proximity of the lakes. In fact, my grandmother's brother was actually featured in a 1937 issue of Outdoor Life magazine where they showed him out duck hunting. And I always thought that was kind of a neat story that we got told here in the family. And my grandfather, he participated in a lot of like duck hunting and pheasant hunting and stuff. And him and the boys, they would go out, and that's what they would do on their free time. And that guy that I was telling you about there, that was in the Outdoor Life magazine, that's him right there in the corner there. And he was quite the local hunter around here back in the day. But yeah, duck hunting was huge. There were even guys around here that built layout boats, built duck boats that they could take out in the bay. It was a really really big thing. Even into the war years, there were guys that were too old to go to the war, and they still hunted even during World War II. And one of the stories, I think I've told that before in different videos, but one of the stories was there were different guys around here that went up north hunting, but you couldn't buy ammunition during the war. But they had ammunition that they had bought prior to the war because they knew kind of shit was going to hit the fan. So they were squared away, and they took their ration cards, being farmers and stuff. They got fuel ration cards, and they would kind of hoard those back, and then they would use that for fuel so they could take their old cars up north and still go deer hunting even during the war. And this right here, it's a back tag there from the war years. It's 1943 deer license, and this actually belonged to my uncle. Believe it or not, my uncle was quite a bit older than my father, but that was one of his deer licenses. And fishing was big too. And fishing, there was a lot of commercial fishing, and there was a lot of hook and line fishing. There was a lot of ice fishing. And it's another story that I got told quite a bit. My grandfather on my mother's side, him and his buddy Levi, they would go out on the lake, and they would stay out there for several days. They would take shanty out there with them. They would pull it out, and they would pull sleighs with them, and they would put firewood on those sleighs, and they would go out there and they'd have a little ice shanty stove. And ice shanty stoves were similar to what a hot tent stove is today, and they would have that inside their shanty, and they would light that up, and they would just basically live out there on the ice for a few days until they had what they thought was enough fish to bring back. They'd catch the fish, put them out on the ice, put snow on top of them, let them freeze solid, and then they would bring them all back. In fact, they would even hang them inside the ice ice shanty stove, they would have a little trap door in the stovepipe. They would open that up. They would put a piece of wire through the gills of the fish, and they would hang a fish right in there to cook and smoke while they were fishing, and they would eat that while they were out there. One of the things that they would fish quite prolifically is what we call walleye today, but they never called them walleye back then. They called them pickerel, and pickerel was the fish that they fished. And of course, perch was another thing. Pike would be speared, and spear and pike, they would put a decoy down in the ice fishing hole to draw the pike in, and they would hang the spear from the top of the shanty, and then they would pick that spear up and they drop that down, and that's how they would spear the pike. Pike spearing, spending time out on the ice like that was a big thing. They'd take little saws with them, and they'd either walk back to shore. There were a lot of sandbars back then where there would be brushy areas on, and they would take those little saws with them, and they'd cut all that brush down, and they would bring that back, and they'd cut that up, and that would all go into their ice shanty stove. The same thing with it was a big deal when they would collect ice off the lake. They would go out there with one-man cross-cut saws, and they would cut blocks, bring that all in. They'd have teams of horses to bring that back in, and they'd have an ice house somewhere. Every community had an ice house, every community had a sawmill, and every community had a grits mill. It's just how it was back then. Even if you get into the grits mill stories, most farms would plant a certain portion of their farm. They would plant specifically for their own wheat to have their own flour ground. But the sawmill, one of the byproducts of the sawmill, of course, is sawdust, and that's what they would use to pack those blocks of ice in the ice house. So then they would have ice into the summer. And I had my share of hunting and fishing and trapping tales too, and this is actually one of my fur harvester licenses from back in the day. Trapping was big around here, especially for stuff like muskrat, because muskrat actually makes some of the best mittens that you can possibly have, because the fur is sort of waterproof and they're very warm. So trapping was kind of the thing that most of the young guys would start with, and then they would move into the deer hunting and stuff. But it usually went fishing, trapping, and then hunting. And of course, younger version of myself there with a nice buck I got back many years ago already. But these old hunting and fishing tales are something always fun to reminisce and trade stories with people. And I've heard a lot of stories from other families and stuff around here, but it's really ingrained into the tradition around here. So I thought I would just take a little time here and tell you guys a little story, get your mind off some of the bad things that are happening in the world, and just kind of hit pause on all that stuff and just have a conversation about something else for once. But anyway, this is Modern Refugee. Appreciate all my subscribers out there. Hope you guys got a little entertainment and a little information out of this video here, just sharing some of my old stories. You guys have a good one.